So now let's start to actually dig a little bit deeper into the world of object-oriented programming and some of these different concepts here between abstraction, polymorphism, inheritance, and encapsulation. So since abstraction and encapsulation are oftentimes talked about together and oftentimes confused, let's take those two things together through an example. So I'm going to use this basic console application as a shell for what I'm going to do, but in all actuality, this could be running in any sort of project template and probably across several different project templates, maybe using some class libraries or something of that nature, and then ultimately including those as references into a console application or an ASP.NET application or anything like that. So let's first begin with a concept. Let's say we are designing some system based on customers and ultimately customer information. This is a very common scenario with most companies and businesses that you're going to have to retain some sort of information about a customer. So let's start to define what that means. So we're going to do this by creating a class. So I'll drop down a couple lines here and I'm going to create a class. We'll call this customer. So we're going to keep this relatively simple for the time being, but let's just start to define some of the characteristics that might be associated with a customer within our system. So we'll create a property here. So a customer is probably going to have a first name. So we'll say that there's a first name property. We'll create another one that's going to be the last name. And there can be a whole series of other information in here, maybe an email address or something like that. So we'll call one email. And then ultimately, once we have this information about the customer, we're typically going to need to do some sort of processing against that particular customer. Now that can mean a whole different slew of things, but we'll keep it relatively simple. And let's say we ultimately want to take this and store this information somewhere. So what we would typically do, and I'm going to really boil this down to very simplistic things, is let's say now I want to be able to store this customer within a database. Now, you could design this in a million different ways, but I'm just going to keep it all locally into this concept of a customer so we can kind of see how this whole thing plays out. So first we'll create a public method here, and it's going to return a Boolean, and this one's going to be called validate. So we want to be able to validate this particular customer to make sure that maybe the first name and last name as well as the email property all meet some sort of rules that allow this to be a valid customer. So you could put all sorts of logic in here. So we'll just say there's going to be some sort of validation logic, and then ultimately we're going to return whether or not this is valid or not. So in this case, we'll just return true just to keep it very simplistic. Some other things that we might need to do is we might need to actually have some sort of method that's going to be able to add this to some sort of repository somewhere, whether that's a database or to the file system or something along those lines. So we'll say that we're going to have a public bool method here. We'll call this one save. So we'll save this somewhere. So this is going to contain the save logic. And then ultimately we'll just return true for the time being. And then in between there could be a number of other steps. We could have other things in there that maybe are going to set up the database connections or anything like that if you want to persist them. So maybe there's some data setup maybe. So we could have some data setup, some other method here. And then we're going to also have some logic in this step. And then ultimately we'll return some value to say whether or not this succeeded or not. So as you can see, we're going to have a number of things that start to happen along the way as we start to build out this system, this customer-based system. We've now created a class, right? So we have the first name, last name, email. We can now validate it. We can do some sort of database setup. We'll make this a little bit more explicit database setup, and then we can ultimately save this. So how are we going to use this ultimately? So if we come back up here to our class program into our main method, we can come in here and we can start to create new instances of this. So I could say var customer1 is going to be equal to a new instance of our customer class. So now what do we do with this? Well, we could set some properties. So we could come in here and say, well, the first name is going to be Derek and the last name is going to be Jensen. And the email is going to be something. And then ultimately what we want to do is we want to go down some sort of process of being able to get this customer object ready to be saved so that we can retrieve it later on. So based on the way that we've designed our customer class here, it looks like we would have to do something like this. Customer1 dot, well, we probably would want to validate it. And then maybe we'd want to do some sort of database setup. So we'd have to do customer1.database setup. And then we can, after we've done all of those things properly, we could probably call this save method. So we'll go ahead and say customer1.save. So there you have it. So here is the process of working with a customer object all throughout your application every single time you want to use it. So this starts to seem a little bit complex. So yeah, I can understand creating an object. This is nothing new. And then although I do think that it's going to be necessary to do a validation step and probably some sort of setup for our database, or maybe get a connection or something like that, and then ultimately save. From a consumer perspective, and when I say consumer at this point, I'm really referring to a developer that's probably using our class definition or our customer object. This seems a little verbose. This seems a little bit too much work for somebody to actually use our class to do something. So how can we simplify this for somebody to actually use? Well, we could come down here and take a look at our customer class definition again and say, all right, well, this whole validate, this seems like a little bit too much. They shouldn't have to do this explicitly. Maybe we could handle that behind the scenes. So let's go ahead and make this private. So now we're going to use that privately within our customer class. And probably something similar with database setup. You really don't want the end consumer or end user to have to worry about how to do any sort of connection setup or anything like that. So maybe we'll make this private as well. But those steps still need to happen. We still need to validate that this is a good customer. We still are going to have to do some database setup, and then we ultimately want to save. We just don't want the consumer of our class within the application to have to worry about those. So maybe we only handle all of these things together within the save method. So in here we could call validate, and we could call database setup, and then we could do whatever else it is we need to do to save it in here, and then ultimately return the result of all three of these operations. So now we don't have to worry about doing a validate or a database setup explicitly. All we have to worry about from a consumer's perspective now is creating an instance of our customer and then ultimately saving it. Now this seems to be a fairly simplistic idea, but this covers both the concepts of abstraction as well as encapsulation all at the same time. So let's rewind just a bit and talk about what it is we did. So we came into our Visual Studio with the concept of we need to build some sort of customer-based system. So that's kind of starting to begin to define the what. So we are doing what within our application? We're going to store some data that's associated with a customer. So we begin to build our customer. We start to build this concept or class of what a customer is from our perspective. So from our perspective, we're really designing this customer to have a first name and a last name and an email address, and then ultimately have some operations around it, namely being able to validate it, doing some database setup, and then ultimately saving it. So in my mind, the process of going through and modeling what the real world concept of a customer is and transforming it into this blueprint of what our application is going to think or use or define a customer as is that abstraction, that translation of a real world concept into some piece of code that's ultimately going to represent that customer. That is abstraction. So it's the translation of real world into part of our application as a class. Now, encapsulation is the process of simplifying or hiding some of the more complex aspects of our code so that the end user or the consumer of this code doesn't need to worry about it. Now that's the second piece that we did. So we noticed that originally when we created this customer, we had to do 3 steps just to be able to save it somewhere. We had to validate that the information that was provided into the customer was good. Then we had to do some database setup, maybe get a connection string or make sure we have access to the database or something along those lines, and then ultimately save it. But that seemed to be a lot of work for a consumer to have to go through every single time they want to work with a customer. So what we did was we refactored a little bit to say, you know what, we don't think our end users should have to worry about the validation or this database setup. All they should have to do is create this customer object and save it. So we transformed the validate and the database setup methods from public to private, so that now all we have to do is call save, and that's ultimately going to handle everything else that's going on within here. And that would be the process of encapsulation, or hiding some of the implementation details that the end user or the consumer doesn't need to know about. So there are the first two fundamental aspects of object-oriented programming, whereas abstraction and encapsulation can sometimes be considered similar concepts because they tend to happen at some of the same times at the beginning or all throughout your process of creating this particular application. So in the next two lessons, we'll start to talk a little bit more about this concept of polymorphism as well as inheritance.